HASP member Linda Walvoord has a BA from Hope College and a PhD from the University of Chicago. She taught English and writing in several colleges before retiring from the University of Cincinnati. I'm going to leave off the date there. She has a keen interest in both autobiography and nonviolent resistance. And she is a niece of as we're going to hear, she is a niece of Carl Verduin, and she recalls visits and conversations with him during his long life. And I'm just going to point out as a personal note that my first HASP class was taught by you, and I kept coming back. Thank you. Welcome, Linda.
I have bravely called this Carl Verduin liberal Protestant. And I could have called him Carl Verduin contrary thinker, Carl Verduin war protester, Carl Verduin Calvinist, Carl Verduin a misfit. But I chose liberal Protestant because of the way that Carl starts his memoir. Now, Carl Verduin was my uncle, and I'd like to pause to introduce my cousin, Eileen Raphael, who came all the way up here from Saugatuck in order to enjoy this presentation today about Uncle Carl. And because Eileen did grow up in South Holland, which I didn't, we were visitors, our family visited frequently, but Eileen grew up in South Holland. So questions about that place and its history is going to be enhanced by Eileen. Also, I want to give full credit to my Eileen's sister, Kathleen Verduin, who is a professor of English at Hope right now. And Kathleen did tremendous work to get this together because she had proposed a study of this memoir for her Hope College freshmen this fall. They take a critical thinking class in the fall. It can be any subject that the professor decides they will study for that fall term. So Kathy used a nice narrow subject like war and peace for their studies. And so they've been looking at literary texts, historical things, and different viewpoints as they study war and peace. And so this memoir made its way into Kathy's reading list. So before I go back to liberal Protestant, let's look at the way that Carl's memoir starts, because our topic today is going to be Carl's memoir. And we're going to divide it this week and next week into two sections so that we spend today getting to know who Carl was as he heads into 1940, 1941, 1942, and the beginnings of the war. And then next week, we'll look at of course, the rest of his memoir and the appendix, which is you will receive this coming week. There's an appendix that's short, but it gives you important information. This gives us a way of asking ourselves all the way through this study, what did Carl know at the time? Carl was a freshman at Hope College in 1939-40 academic year. So we're going to find out who he was and a little bit about what he would have known at that time. And since his memoir was written for his own children, grandchildren, nephews, and nieces, of which he had abundant nephews and nieces, to carry on the story that came down in the family of his experience as a conscientious objector. Coming in 1939-40, the war wasn't underway yet. But in 1940, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which was the first peacetime draft. Now, had people been drafted in World War I? Yes, right? But when they were drafted, we were already in war. They didn't draft until we knew that we were going to be fighting. But yes, there were draftees in World War I. Were there draftees in the Civil War? okay? Were there draftees in the Revolutionary War? Well, only to the extent that the state militias were using ways of manning their forces. It would have been state militias, I think, but I'm not primarily a historian, so we'll leave those questions aside. But this was the first peacetime draft. So in 1940, as he's finishing his freshman year, what happened in 1940? Germany demolished France in 4 days. Nobody expected the French military organization to be just overrun with bombs and invasion, and the kind of blitzkrieg we now know was Hitler's style. But this was news to them that a country like France could be just out of the running in 1940, in a very short period of time. In order to save Paris from being bombed, they decided to evacuate Paris and make a deal with the Germans that they would submit to German occupation in the north and not complete occupation in the south. So the French were completely hands tied behind their backs within that year. What's left? Did the Netherlands expect to be overrun in 4 days as they were? No, because in World War I, the Kaiser went around the Netherlands. The Netherlands was never attacked in World War I. So as World War II approaches, they're safe saying, oh, well, they'll respect our neutrality, because they respected neutrality in World War I. Well, according to Hitler, that was a big mistake that Kaiser had made. And this time he was going to do it right and knock out the Netherlands right away. So the Netherlands was knocked out. So Dutch people in this country were excruciatingly aware of that, to learn in 1940 that the Netherlands was not like we thought. And during the war, Rotterdam was bombed to a pile of rubble. Rotterdam, a major port for shipping in and out, and an important part of the Netherlands. So we have these things going around us, and Carl would have known about them. Now let's look at the first few paragraphs of the memoir itself, because we always want to be coming back to this. And remember, he has a double view. When he writes this in 1999, he's 78 years old. And so he's looking back on what he remembers about being a junior at Hope. So how many of you have or can possibly put yourself back into who you were and how you thought and what you knew when you were a junior in college or a freshman in college? Do you think about that? He's going to say very early that it's characteristic of older people like ourselves to think back over our past and kind of think more deeply about things that happened to us, especially important turning points in our lives. So let's look at the way this starts. It's going to tell us exactly what he did and what we are talking about to narrow down our frame. It has been over 50 years since I spent 33 months in civilian public service, CPS, the Selective Service Program for conscientious objectors during World War II. We were supposedly doing, quote, work of national importance under civilian direction. In other words, what he's doing is legal, because the Selective Service Program that Congress passed in 1940 carved out room for the conscientious objector to act legally and be a pacifist. So was he a draft dodger? No. He needed to go home and report to his draft board, his local draft board back in South Holland, who he probably knew, his family probably knew, 5 of those people on that draft board. But he's got to go and sign up and be registered. Do young men still register today? Yep. Through the driver's license program and through other ways that they're all on the list that the government has. So he doesn't have to go rogue. He doesn't have to become illegal in order to do what he feels powerfully motivated to do. There's a program for conscientious objectors, but does he know this during his high school years? No, because they didn't pass that law yet in Congress. The war was looming. Germany was doing what it was doing. Poland was overrun in 1939. Hitler was already on the march. As all old people are wont to do, I often reminisce about that episode in my youthful life. So Carl has this double vision. He remembers how he was then, and he's contemplating it now, which is where our sense of drama or pathos or sympathy, what you didn't know at the time, how it would turn out. Let's name 2 or 3 things that came out of World War II that Carl Verduin could, or anybody else, could not possibly have known in 1940. Outcomes of World War II that everybody remembers today. Holocaust. Boom, atomic bomb. And many other things, but those are the 2 that stand out for us. The same way that if a certain person we all know decided to invade Venezuela now, it looks like chicken feed. It looks like, hey, we could do that in a week or 2. But some of us who know more about history say, you never know what something can turn into. And when you start it, you have no idea what could come of this. So for what audience is he going to write this? For members of your family who were not yet born when these things happened, she replied. Well, in a way, we're members of his family because we have a lot in common with Carl in some ways. Connection with Hope College, for one. Your experiences are historical and unique. They deserve to be recorded. Well, does every war story told by your favorite uncle at a Thanksgiving deserve to be recorded? Well, Mark Twain once said, I remember everything that ever happened to me and some things that didn't. So the blend of our memory and the way we look at things changes over time. If you've contemplating a point in your life where you made a huge decision that had great consequences that you didn't see at that time, then you certainly understand this double viewpoint he's going to have. Well, in fact, these old experiences are dear to my memory, so maybe they'll be of interest. Now, I'm going to tell you that in the next paragraph, in the prelude, he's going to tell you what he's not going to tell you. What's he going to leave out of his account? First of all, he says, in 1942, which was his 3rd year at Hope College, when I was required to register for the draft, compared with most young people today, meaning in the 1990s when he's writing it, I was innocent and a naive young man, but certain aspects of my individuality were beginning to emerge. So he's now going to describe in old age exactly what he was like in 1942. And we're going to see whether what he says here is really what we see in the narrative that we're going to read. He calls himself, I had decided not to be a farmer like my father and 2 older brothers. I felt destined to be different, to follow a different star, to explore an unfamiliar path. I was very idealistic, critical of conventional mores, daring with trepidation to make up my own mind about things. I feared and resented regimentation and coercion of any kind. I was anything but a braggart, timid on the surface, but stubborn and intense on the inside. I knew that if I were drafted into the Army, I would be subjected to indoctrination and training that would be abhorrent to me. I could never be a soldier. It would be alien to my nature. I would not conform. I would never let them make me into a killer. Now, notice he's not saying I was afraid of dying. He's saying I didn't want to become a killer through the indoctrination that has to go along with war to make a young man ready to kill somebody without chickening out, as some people would say. So it's interesting that it's not fear for his own life that he says was his main motivation. I was desperate about what to do. Someone said to me, why don't you register as a conscientious objector? Now, yes.
Do you know what his major was, his major and minors, and how many male students were on Hope's campus in 42? Because none of them lived on campus. They were in the surrounding homes.
I can't give you a number for the size of the total Hope population, but in 1929, when Dimnant Chapel was built, Hope had about 400 students. In other words, nothing like what it takes to fill up Dimnant Chapel. It's like build it and they will come. But it might have been 800 or 1,000. You know, these are guesses. I'm not sure. And certainly all the young men at Hope at that time would have had advisors. You have a faculty advisor. Could you go to your faculty advisor at Hope and listen, and that advisor would listen to your story? And if you were thinking in terms of how can I not have to serve, I can't possibly serve, one of those advisors at Hope would say, well, there's a legal way to serve without going into combat. And it's likely that that was possible. And then he's going to mention later one particular professor that he runs into, whose name is Kurt Reilersdam. Sounds Dutch and is Dutch. And he was a professor of Old Testament at Hope College, and later associated with Western Seminary, and later went to the University of Chicago as a professor of Old Testament in their divinity school. So this was a very qualified person in Old Testament who could introduce Carl to the pacifist element of Judaism and of Christianity, to point out to him that there is room for pacifism within the Christian faith. And that's what he's calling liberal Protestantism. Now, where in the next paragraph, he says,
can we back up?
yes.
Okay, the first 5 paragraphs, there seems to be a dialogue in there. For what audience, I ask, and then she replied in the next paragraph. Who's the I and who's the she in this?
Oh, he says that he writes this for his family who asked him to record his memories. Experience, one very good friend who had often heard me tell tales about my CPS experiences has urged me to write them down. I'm sorry, he just refers to one good friend here, probably in the family or something.
Okay, so for who's the one that says for what audience, I ask? Who's the I there?
Carl asks her that.
Okay.
Carl asks her.
Okay. And
what
who's the
audience
her?
would I
Who's the
write
her?
this?
Some member of his family, some woman in his
I don't
family?
think he named that person. I think he meant a particular person, but he doesn't use her name.
Okay, so it's, okay, that's
But
the
she's-
general answer.
It's very
Okay.
possible that she is a member of his family, because she's going to answer for members of your family who were not born yet, so that your family story lives on. So the second page of this, second paragraph, it is not my intention to expound my pacifist philosophy here, nor trace my religious odyssey in his family. In other words, the family religion with which he grew up, which sprang from these first encounters with liberal theologies. He's saying that until he got to Hope College, he never met liberal theologies. Okay, so is that the way you would interpret this? He didn't have any exposure to liberal theology thinking. So we're talking about liberal theology. Now, when I use the term liberal here, I'm referring to a theological world where a belief system that is larger than Carl realizes when he comes from South Holland. He's going to discover this through Kurt Reilersdam, for one, And through perhaps stories of other Hope College graduates who had gone in a pacifist direction, namely one whose name is, does anybody know? A.J. Musty had graduated, I think, in 1912 or something, who became a leading pacifist and also Reformed church pastor in his training. Liberal theologies, plural, so different ways of looking at the key questions that a religious person will ask about war. So I registered as a conscientious objector. Now here, and was denied this classification by my local draft board in Illinois. Are we surprised at this? No. What are they saying down there on that draft board? What are you doing here? You're not a Quaker. You're not in, Jehovah's Witnesses or one of these weirdo denominations. What are you doing here? And we're not going to let you off. You're just a whiner. Isn't that the way people looked at people who objected? Why are you here? And he could say, because it's legal for me to be here. And I believe that I qualify as a pacifist under the selective service program that was passed last year. That's what he'd been told about as the peacemaking move that he could take. But they said no. I appealed their decision to the next higher selective service board in Chicago. Well, all right. This action automatically triggered an investigation by the FBI. By this time, I was home for the 1942 summer recess from Hope College. When FBI agents began to question local people about my reputation and possible political affiliations, the whole South Holland community learned of my pacifist position, like they didn't know already. And it became the topic of much gossip and speculation. What do you think they were saying? Well, if my son has to sign up, what's the matter with you? You already decided you don't want to be a farmer, and now you don't want to be a soldier. What are you going to make of yourself if you're not going to do either one? What are you, just a lazy bum? They would say that behind his back. And they would say, oh, I feel so sorry for Rena and Tunis to have a son who will not go in to do his duty. And so his family were either treated with sympathy, or I knew they were not being tough enough on Carl when he grew up. He's the baby of the family. He's the youngest son. He's his mother's pet child. And he was just allowed to be sort of a rebel when he was in high school. And now look what became of it. He's a war protester. Now, is that the way it was in South Holland? And I'm going to go through there's another side to this story, because Carl is more than just a liberal Protestant as he's going to mature in his thinking in college, which he says he's not going to go into in this memoir. And we're not going to go into it either, except briefly today. To be a liberal, you have to be a contrary thinker. You have to be willing to think differently than the majority thinks and believe humbly that you are right while respecting those other people. That's the idea. Multiple positions on something are permissible and are not some kind of good versus evil contest. And that is an element that he's receiving from his family. And I'm going to show you why. Because if you're a contrary thinker, then you're thinking outside the box. And I'm going to show you ways in which his own family, his parents and his siblings, were also thinking outside the box in different ways in the choices that they made in their lives and exemplified them to their children. My mother, Marie Verduin Walvoord, was 8 years older than Carl, and she had enrolled in Hope College in 1930. Well, how did the only girl out of 6 children get to have her family send her to college in 1930? How could they send her to college? It's the Depression. Well, she found a way, and she really wanted to come to Hope College. and they supported her, especially her mother supported her. And you're going to see a little bit about Rena Verduin here because a man's mother is extremely important in his life. Am I right? Especially in his adolescent years. And so is his father. So we're going to take a good look at his mother and his father for what habits of thinking or habits of life or approach to their own major choices in life represented choosing another path than the most obvious one. Also, we had an American heritage of resistance. In 1849, Thoreau wrote his famous essay called Civil Disobedience. And that had a profound influence. And by the 1930s, if you were going to a good high school, which he was, you would probably read that essay. Would you agree with me, Judy, that that essay by that time was already common? Okay, but it could have been in an English class that you read. And had the life of all of the abolitionists who were contrary thinkers, and the abolitionists rallied this ability to take the other side. So there was a tradition already of civil disobedience, and civil disobedience does not mean breaking the law and paying no price. Civil disobedience includes paying the price. If you're doing civil disobedience, you are willing to go to jail or pay the fine or even suffer the torture, taking in the religious stream of this, in which at times all of the Protestants were creating massive disobedience to the all-powerful monarch or Catholic monarchy, where they may have suffered oppression. And certainly the religious wars of the 17th century were two-sided, and not everybody was pure of heart completely, but there was a lot of suffering that went on as religious people stood for that. And besides, among the Beatitudes is, blessed are those who suffer for righteousness' sake, persecuted. In fact, the word is persecuted. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Doesn't promise you good times on earth, but there's some grand way in which you're part of the will of God in being persecuted for righteousness' sake. Now, if you're persecuted for righteousness' sake and that's religion, that's one thing. But what about if it's for justice? Blessed are those who are persecuted because they fought for justice, or because they had a different view of justice and injustice, or, I'm going in the direction now that Carl is not going to go. He doesn't want to get off into the weeds of how specifically he intellectually discovered that pacifism was a legal route, and it was the route for him, regardless of the fact that he did know by 1940, I believe, that his sweetheart's brother was signing up. And that in many families in South Holland, in the churches, the young men were they were registering with the draft, and then they were being chosen. But what was their chance of being chosen? Now let's take a look at that. In 1940, I believe, I did some work with the numbers, I think your odds of being chosen from among men between 18 and 35, which was the first age group to register, I think it was 1 out of 16. So if you could create honor and standing for yourself and a certain amount of credit for doing your civic duty, and your chance of ever having to be drafted at all was only 1 out of 16, and then even that you had a good chance of being in non-combat. Not everybody was assigned to combat. So you could take the attitude, take your chances. If there's no strong moral conviction that you have to go another way. Now, was everybody in favor of going into World War II in 1940? No. The general public, I selected an article that appeared in written by the Chicago Tribune editorial board on October 2nd, 1940. So this is in the fall of 1940. And on this, and it was published in the Tribune just this past fall, on this day 85 years ago. So it's published this past October too, on this day. And it said, drafted for what is the question? Millions of young Americans will be going back to the schoolhouse of theirs, October 16, but not to go to school. They are registering for the peacetime draft. From among their number, 400,000 conscripts will be selected for the first training period. Later, another 400,000 will be put into uniform. None of these young men knows with any certainty what is in store for him. In the Draft Act, there are limitations. It is not to be sent to European or Asian battlefields, this peacetime draft. But those limitations would be immediately wiped out by any decision the Washington government made later requiring expeditionary force. Walter Trohan of the Tribune, after a survey of American military opinion, reported that the Army men were almost one in the belief that war was the prospect. So the guys already in the Army are certain it's war. This apparently is the prevalent opinion in Washington. So the Tribune isn't trying to say there's going to be war. They're saying who says there's going to be war. The Democratic slogan in the 1916 campaign, when there was war in Europe and when Mr. Wilson was seeking his second term, was he kept us out of war. Wilson tried to get his second term by promising, I'm going to keep you out of war. But did he? No. Less than a year passed before, boom, we're in World War I. Mr. Wilson already had committed himself to the support of the Allies if Germany should refuse to make peace. So the Tribune is faulting, Wilson for pretending that he was going to be peaceful or keep us out of war when he knew darn well that we would be getting into it. Claims the Tribune. I'm not saying that, the Tribune is saying this. At the time, the American people were voting for a man who was to become a war president, and they didn't know it. In this election, the country has seen much more of the intentions of the government in Washington. Mr. Roosevelt's administration has gone so far on the road to war that a Japanese-German-Italian alliance has been formed to serve notice that if the United States enters one war, it will have two on its hands. So the Tribune is nailing it, that if we go in against Germany, then Japan and Italy and the Japanese are going to get into war in East Asia. And the Tribune is pointing out, Mr. Roosevelt has done the same as Wilson. He's already made deals that are going to draw us into war, even though they're saying in the Selective Service Act, oh, don't worry, we're only selecting 400,000. They're going to just be trained, but they're not going to go to Asia or Europe unless Germany won't surrender. Unless Germany makes more trouble for us. They won't be going, but Germany made more trouble for us, as you can see. So the Tribune is, in a way, it sounds like this article is sort of against Roosevelt or accusing Roosevelt of pulling the wool over people's eyes about his actual intentions and to get some kind of army somewhat ready before we went into World War II. Now, when we went into World War II, were we ready? Did we have our, no. When James Bratt, who we're going to meet in just a few minutes, has been teaching his summary of American religious history. He made this point too, that both Roosevelt and Wilson had to use very skillful public management of what the public knew, so that they could get the majority on their side to have Congress give their blessing to World War I and World War II. And remember, the congressmen of that time, who would be, middle-aged and older men, would have memories of World War I. Was World War I what they expected? No, they thought, well, hey, the Yanks are coming. It's going to be over in a short time. You know the song, over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, they're stumbling everywhere. So beware, say a prayer, send the word over there. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there. So who said, well, you're only going to have to serve for a year and then it'll be all over? That was the first deal. But if the war goes on and on, then you have to stay to the end. So look at the message that people were getting. And the Tribune is saying, don't believe everything you hear from the government. I mean, in a way, when it concerns war, read your own, as they had gone into the Pentagon people that they had contact with and polled the army men who believed uniformly that there would be war. How much of this could Carl Verduin know? We're going to say focused on how much could Carl know at the time he was making these decisions. Okay. How many of you have had a chance to read this all the way through? How many of you are you're into it, but not to the second part yet? Okay, good, because today we're just going to go about halfway through is my plan. We'll see how it works out and finish reading the memoir next week. But I'm going to set down a certain number of guidelines for us so that our discussion doesn't get too unwieldy. Would you agree that just like War and Peace is a big subject, World War II is a big subject too? And there are a lot of highways and byways that we could go down. Besides, in our age group, there's probably not a single person who doesn't have in their family some kind of memory or history of someone who participated or didn't participate in a war, in any war, but even including World War II. I have an aunt who's going to be 104 this year on the Walvoord side, and her husband was in the Coast Guard. And so there are still widows alive and telling stories that they remember firsthand of someone who fought in World War II. And I'm going to briefly mention this on the other side of our family, that Aunt Lorraine's husband, Raymond, my father's brother, served in the Coast Guard, the safest of the 5 units, of the 5 divisions of the Army. But on a Coast Guard cutter, that's an icebreaker, and it's up in Labrador, looking for radar on Russian or Japanese subs. You could watch your own bunkmate fall overboard. And the ship is so crowded with ice, there's no way to turn around. And so he and other people had to stand there and watch that guy drown in the freezing water, which would only take about 20 minutes, but those 20 minutes would be absolutely agonizing, that there's absolutely nothing they could do. And so he had that memory for the rest of his life. Go back to the bunkhouse and there are his clothes hanging there. He's gone now. So it's just, that's the way war is. So a death right in your immediate family of watching someone go down. Now, Raymond, her husband, had a military funeral because he served in the Coast Guard and he was always very devoted to the Coast Guard. And so is his son, who's on a cutter right now in the Northern Seas. His son is in charge of a big deal up where the trouble is, up there, with much better radar these days than they had in World War II. And so we all have stories of who died, who didn't die but came back, or who died and came back a completely different person. And we remember more than one war. We remember World War II. Then some of us remember the Korean War. My first husband was in the Air Force in the Korean War. Then we remember Vietnam. Then we remember Iraq. Then we remember Afghanistan, and all these wars that are just completely different than any war we've fought before. Like, it seems like every war is completely different than the previous war. Like World War I was trench warfare. You dug a trench, you sat in there, and you tried to, shoot out before somebody could shoot into the trench. And therefore, bombing became a very major thing. Now in World War II, boy, is bombing a major thing. Look at Rotterdam, it's a pile of rubble. And Paris, because they knew what had happened at Rotterdam, they evacuate Paris and just give up because they want to save Paris. So the saying is, when emotions run high, when bullets fly. Yes.
Carl could have gone a different route because he didn't have to register as a conscientious objector. He could have waited till induction and not step forward. And then he would have been in the same program. This happened during Vietnam.
Okay.
And so he took a more public route that involved, say, the whole community there in South Haven or South Holland.
Yeah.
Which if he had just waited till he was inducted.
All right, that's a very good point, that you could go ahead and get inducted if you were the one who got drafted. You're registered to be drafted.
Right.
And then according to what your number is, or whether you have an
Right.
exemption, then you could be brought in. And if you're brought in, you can say, I want a non-combat role.
No. In Michigan, if you were inducted, if your number came up, you went to Detroit where you took the oath to be in the military. And you step forward, they read the oath. If you step forward, you're in it. If you don't, you're an objector.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And that was a state law then?
No, that's a federal law.
That was a federal law.
Federal law, yes.
All right.
We had a neighbor who did exactly that because I had been in the military, was still in at the time with Vietnam.
Okay.
And their son really questioned. He was a Calvin student, excellent student. And finally, when it ended up, he did not step forward in Detroit, spent 2 years as an orderly in the U of M hospital, unpaid. He had to pay his own rent. But that was how he served.
Okay.
And just like Carl did, which is very acceptable, but he could have gone a different, much less public way
Okay.
of all the investigation.
Okay. This suggests that the route that he took was equally legal. It was also completely legal. And the type of work he would be doing unpaid would be something sort of similar to what Carl's going to go through. But there was less of a price to pay back home. Or would anyone who did not step forward, that means you're just one of those war objectors who won't step up to your duty? I mean, was there some backlash to that? No? Okay. Yes. Wait, just a minute. We better get the microphone for this because. Okay. Say.
I'm sorry. The route he took is fine. I don't disagree. That's an honorable way to do it. But it's less of a legal struggle getting his family involved, the community involved. Just wait till you're drafted when the number came up. And you don't step forward, you don't take the oath for the military. And you're automatically going to be put in some type of program like this.
Okay. So, and that would still be though into civilian public service. That would still be CPS that he's put into. Something like that, because I think as we move forward, you'll see that they mix in the camps that Carl is going to be going to. There's a mixture of the people who did this and the people who, like Carl said in the beginning, you register and you have your draft number, but you are declaring conscientious objector at that time. Okay, yeah.
Regarding what he said, though, I'm kind of curious because isn't that what Muhammad Ali did. He went, he got inducted, said, but I'm not going to fight. And he got thrown in prison.
Okay, I think you're right there. I
Yeah.
think you're right. But that was a different war and different rules in a different war, probably.
Okay, am I hearing you say that because he chose that route, people were critical of him?
Oh, yes, we'll go forward from here. Mhm.
Okay, my dad, his number came up and he couldn't serve because he's 6'3" and they did not have a uniform to fit him. And if our son, who has a size 12 shoe, was one of those people, he couldn't serve because they didn't have shoes to fit him.
Okay,
Now, my dad never suffered any discrimination. He went to work in the war factories and
Okay.
everybody accepted that.
Right.
He never told us that he felt different
Mhm.
or not participating. So what I think Carl is, he's feisty. That's like just about the best way. And he wants to make a statement. And he does.
mhm. Okay. Very good point. That brings up the point of exemptions because I said, yeah,
There was no pay doing it the way John's friend did. Was there pay for those who were conscientious objectors?
no. Carl,
They worked in the hospitals without pay.
yes. Mhm, yes. Okay. Let's go forward here. Carl was born in 1922. He was the youngest of 6 children in the family. His mother, Rena Rietveld Verduin, was 40 when he was born. She had 6 children born between 1910 and 1922. 6 children in 12 years. Pretty good, right? No twins. Rena was busy. We can certainly attest to that. Carl had 3 sisters and 2 brothers. Both of his older brothers had draft exemptions, which is what we're talking about here now, because a farmer can exempt 2 sons, but not 3. So we're going to look at Carl's parents, Rena Rietveld and Tunis Verduin, ages 28 and 24. He's 24. She is 28. Are they liberals or conservatives? Well, let's look at their history of following the rules versus doing something that's a little bit out of the box. If a couple marry from 2 different religious sources, namely Reformed and Christian Reformed, the wife follows the husband. Nope. Tunis followed Rena into the RCA because sharing churches doesn't work. They tried for about a year to go back and forth to 2 churches. I'm sorry, guys, that's not going to work. He readily agrees to do this. Next rule, if she's 4 years older, she is not only a leftover in the marriage market, but she's lucky to get him and she's robbing the cradle. Nope, not only did she rob the cradle, as we say, by marrying someone 4 years younger, she robbed the CRCNA. What is the CRCNA? Christian, yeah, Doug Brower will be called on for this question.
Reformed Church in North America.
Okay,
Yep.
so we have Reformed and Christian Reformed side by side, just as they are in Holland, both developing together and splitting off. And sometimes, as we say, there's no difference so large as a small difference. And so they have those 2 factors in which they chose a marriage, which was not what other people were predicting or expecting or necessarily approved of. Tunis wants to save the money that he can get by homesteading. They marry in 1910. Tunis and Rena married in 1910. In 1908, he wants to save up the money. Of course, he has 2 older brothers. You can't have a farm big enough to split among 3 brothers, let alone 6 children, and anybody have a farm. If he goes to South Dakota, he can do homesteading in South Dakota for 2 years. So she has to wait. A marriage delayed for 3 years, that's an iffy situation, especially that she's 4 years older than he is. Rule, Tunis should marry her in spite of all these. Yep, he does marry her when he gets back from South Dakota because she's the one. Where did they meet? They met in Lansing County Culture Club in a debate. The question in the debate is, should women receive higher education? And Rena volunteers to argue the positive, and somebody else is going to stand up in that same debate and argue the negative, and then the audience will vote on who won the debate. The Lutheran County Culture Club was a fun organization, and Tunis and Rena were both members. They were not the only couple who met there. It was a lot of young people, and it was like a dating pool. Tunis wasn't the only man who noticed Rena in that debate. This was in 1907. I'm going to read you a little passage from the handwritten copy of this debate that my Uncle Carl found in the family papers when he went through their estate. And so this is just a little piece of her speech in favor of women receiving higher education. She herself had been through 5th grade, yet she wrote this herself. After a woman is married, the good master of hers takes her, builds 4 walls around her, and tells her, now, little woman, you just mind your business in here and see to it that everything is kept in good order and that meals are prepared just as I want them and that nothing is prepared that I don't like. And if you need any money, come to your master for it. And never you mind what's going on outside these walls. That's none of your business. We can do very well without you. And he expects the woman to bow her poor head and say amen to all this. So this is a little piece of her argument that women should receive higher education. Now she's going to argue not only that women by receiving higher education will be better mothers, can help their children more if they are educated than if not, but she's also going to argue women should receive higher education because that man may not be there for the rest of her life. Many women lose a husband and have to take care of a family. She started her whole argument by apologizing for her lack of education, but she wasn't able to go to high school even, so she'll have to just do what she can. The topic being debated is whether women should receive higher education, not even if they should have high school, which Rena did not. Yet no one wrote this but her. Look at the way she writes. Look at the way she argues. She did win the debate, and several swains offered her a ride home, she later told her son, Carl. Some husbands are not even satisfied if their wives take good care of the house, but expect her to keep track of everything in and around the barns and stables too yet. How much more Dutch can you be than say too yet? Especially if you're unlucky enough to have to deal with farmers. You can know she got a laugh there. If they lose track of a sack or a bushel basket, a pitchfork, a chicken, or a pig, they march straight to the house and call the woman or girls and expect them to know just where it is. And poor her if she doesn't. She'll have to leave all her work and hunt for it. And if it isn't found, the man will for all the rest of her life think it's the woman's fault. Poor slaves. So she's using exaggeration to make her point. So that speech was in 1907. He's sweet on her, taking a huge risk by even choosing this girlfriend, and he goes away to Homestead from 1908 to 1910. Then he came home and married her at age 24 and 28 after Tunis went to Homestead, his 160 acres in South Dakota, for 2 to 3 years, and she waited and waited and waited. Now 4 people went on this adventure. Tunis, Jen Rietveld, and, Rena is a Rietveld, all related. And they put up, think of 4 squares, each of 160 acres. And on the inside corners, you build a little building, on each thing, because that's the federal, I got to build a building. So a house, a barn, maybe a chicken coop, and a tool shed or something. So they have the buildings that they need. And now if they just raise a crop of some sort, on all four of those things, then they each become the inheritor. They can, if you lose three, if you stay 3 years, you get it for free. If you stay only 2 years, you get it for $1 an acre. And they're doing $1 an acre deal. So they only have to stay 2 years. And all four, including Jen Rietveld, a single woman, would get her own 160 acres. And all she'd have to do is all the washing and all the cooking and a whole lot of other things for these four men, for those three men. And could a married woman do that? Nope. Why not? She's not a head of household. You have to be a head of household. So if you want to get your 160 acres out west, you'll have to go as a single woman. Do you think the married women down the street who were struggling along with their husbands for only 160 acres looked kindly on Jen Rietveld, who was getting one all to herself? I don't know this, but it's another possibility that you could hear that. Now let's take a look at what this looked like. Aunt Jen Rietveld apparently went homesteading because of some great hurt or trauma she had suffered in South Holland. She makes a bleak reference to it in her letters. It's possibly she got her heart broken and she needed a change of place, made a drastic geographical change to get over a heartbreak. It could have been something else. But now she's writing regular letters to Rena. And what's her goal? She wants to persuade Rena, come on out to South Dakota. The weather's nice, we're growing a crop and all the advantages of coming west. And yet Jen wrote this to Rena back in South Holland. I do earnestly hope that someday we will all move west. For between you and all means probably a whole bunch of their family. For between you and me, I will say that I shall never feel contented in South Holland anymore. The real happiness and joy, that which I have always wanted to and have lived up to, has been in a way crushed out of me some years ago. Since then, I am much happier when I am away from there. Can you blame me? That's Jenny Rietveld. What do you notice here? Well, she's referring to some kind of heartache or reason, specific reason, something. They're good friends, so whatever it is, she knows. First of all, how does somebody with just barely a high school education write like this? Look at these sentences in this letter. Did somebody fix this up? This is exactly the way she wrote it. Look at the education that these people have. From what? Well, from reading the Bible backwards and forwards, upside and downside for several generations, and reading a chapter at the table every day. You can't help but become literate by doing that, at the very least. Am I right? The literacy of these people, when you look at, if you think of a farming type of community as being people who have minimal education, you would be wrong. Because look at this letter. Now, Jen writes back to Rena, oh, I'm planting flowers. We've got a beautiful lawn. And I'm riding a pony. And I've learned to ride astride. I don't even ride side saddle. Come on out here where everything is fun in the West. So 1909 comes along and Rena's still writing letters. She and Tunis are writing letters, which we no longer have, and we're really mad at her for that. In 1909, Rena's older sister Jane and her husband Al Tilstra, who is pictured in this picture, made a journey to South Dakota to visit these four homesteaders. Rena desperately wanted to go with them, but as Carl wrote, her father would not give his permission, for it was considered unseemly for a single woman to pay such a visit to a suitor. Rena never forgave him for that. She wrote, what did he think would happen under the eye of her brother, her sister, her brother-in-law, living in tiny shanties? And my sister went into this and got these letters, reviewed these letters. So it makes clear that Rena did not get to see South Holland, but I'm going to go back to this picture of the homesteaders. Now, The train came 65 miles away to some place in South Dakota, like Rapid City or something. But it's amazing what the people in South Holland could send west that they didn't need anymore, like a washing machine that was past its best day, a sewing machine, a great big oven that could take a turkey. All these could be put on the train, picked up 65 miles away in their wagon and haul it back. So it's amazing what they did have. And in fact, Jen persuaded her mother to send her cheap wallpaper. Now look at this building here. Well, it needs a lot more than a little wallpaper to start looking any better. And do you see any grass? Yeah, it's summertime, and Jen is writing up how beautiful it is. You know, so sometimes the letters from afar are going to be the weather's nice, the crops are great, the grass is green, I'm growing my roses, and it's not all that rosy. But we surmise that since Grandma did not save the letters that passed between her and Tunis, Carl surmised that the reason she didn't want to keep them was that she was saying, oh, you think maybe we'd be happier here in South Dakota than back in South Holland, which by now is a respectable village with all that you would expect of a city, little town in 1910. Isn't a woman supposed to follow her husband where he wants to go? Well, Carl surmised that she said, I'll marry you, but only in South Holland. I'm not going to South Dakota because it doesn't offer me what I need. Now I'm going to call on Eileen for a minute to reflect on that. Was your understanding Eileen's father was Carl's next oldest brother?
The question.
That Grandma Verduin would have stood her ground to stay in South Holland rather than to have Tunis's, ambitious idea of bringing her to South Dakota.
Yeah, my understanding was that she kind of put down an ultimatum, and I don't know if it was, the location ultimatum or the time ultimatum. I always understood that she basically said, okay, this is 2 years, and that's too much. You got to come. So my understanding was that the original intention was to stay and do the 3-year claim, but Rena got impatient, and that's why Tunis.
Well, that's making sense too, because he didn't come back until 1910, and they married in that same year. So there was no big time lapse between his return and their wedding. So that makes sense. And of course, it meant that the family had to come up, or he had to come up with $160 to pay the $1 an acre for the 160 acres. Whereas if he stayed the 3rd year, then he'd get it for free. All right. That's quite a sum. 160 is a big sum in those days for these people. So there could have been a lot of negotiating going on in the letters they were writing back and forth, because she wasn't allowed to go out there. Of course, she wants to see for herself, what would I be getting into if I go to this little cluster of people who were taking over that place. Now, my sister's history makes this summary about this is shifting to a little bit different. Rena is exerting her opinions and pleading with Tunis. Not only that has her own opinions, and she has a sense of humor, and she's ready to do a debate, and she's very active at home. And when she comes, as I said, they had 6 children in 12 years. So she's thinking about the fact that while he's homesteading, she's going from age 24 to almost to 28. And they want a family, and she doesn't want to wait. And so that she's pleading for a role that a lot of women might not have had, except for Rena's spirit and Tunis Verduin's willingness to choose her that she's the one. And my sister Barbara did a memoir. My sister's memoir is this big. And so she spends some time talking about what Hope College was like for our mother at Hope College in 1930 to 34. And she makes this conclusion. She goes all through what that was, which was a time of very strict gender limits. Like men and women a lot of times didn't compete in the same things. They had a men's oratory club and a women's oratory club. Because, you know, sometimes women win the debate. You don't want that to happen. If I'm just joking there. But from my sister's history and memoir, she makes this conclusion. Hope College offered my mother and other women students of 1930 to 34 opportunities to modify gender limitations and to exercise power and leadership. Ironically, the strong religious culture, while it reinforced strict gender roles, in some ways also offered opportunities, as it did in my grandmother's South Holland. And you are a good example of where understanding and agreement with a position that is basically pacifist or that is other than the obvious was well accepted and understood by people who loved those people and understood how they were thinking. So that's present in both the CRC and the RCA. A room, would you say room for pacifism was present both in the CRC and in the RCA. There was not a lot of pulpit pounding saying that people were disloyal or unchristian for not going to war or anything like that, even though we still are singing hymns like Onward Christian Soldiers and militaristic hymns that imply a connection between being willing to go to war and being pious. That's my sister. And now we're going to look at two slides that come from James Bratt. Now, James Bratt is currently teaching a 4-section course on the history of American religion. And he was a longtime professor at Calvin with a PhD in history from Yale. And he is describing very well the difference between Protestant liberalism and fundamentalism, which is something that began to emerge in about 1910, that fundamentalism with its 5 pillars came along. So this is James Bratt's slide that he presented a couple of weeks ago. And I highly recommend his class, which is going to be held again next Monday at 1 o'clock. So if you would like a little more of his picture of this, come in on that class on Monday at 1 and you'll get a lot more important information. So Protestant liberalism would be Northeastern, more educated, more prosperous, tended to be managers and professionals of the new industrial order. Their authority, no conflict between science and religion. Very important. Adapt Darwinism to make it teach progress and purpose. And adapt traditional theology to mesh with the findings of science and movement of history. And accept history as post-millennial. Now he'll joke about what that special term means, but that the millennium is moving in a progressive way. The arc of history bends toward progress. Human history is its own revelation, and the Bible and theology are deeply historical. So that's James Bratt's summary of the character of Protestant liberalism, and I'm placing Carl in this kind of environment, which then, therefore, I believe was present as an element in both the Reformed Church and Christian Reformed Church. Judy.
If you come to his class on Monday, bring an extra $5 and
I'll bring an extra $5.
Right. If you're not already enrolled. And James Bratt is offering another, I think, 4-section course in the spring to wrap up history since World War II, from World War II to the present. So be on the lookout for when that spring
He's an
catalog comes
excellent
out.
teacher, and he's really covering the waterfront. Did you have anything to add,
No.
Doug?
No.
He is showing the University of Chicago here in this picture. And this picture is Phillips, somebody who was a great preacher of that time. And this is Rockefeller Center in New York City on Riverside Drive. Rockefeller was a Baptist, and he founded both the University of Chicago and Rockefeller Center, which is in New York City. Now, fundamentalism, James Bratt describes this way: evangelical, necessity of a born-again experience. That's fundamentalist, but it's not liberalism. Lower in socioeconomic status and education, ordinary folks alienated from the emerging order. And I'm saying that's an important point. The view of authority, viewing the Bible as infallible, is a mark of fundamentalism, but not a mark of Protestant liberalism. Viewing the Bible as inerrant originates in the 1880s, not earlier than that. Tendency toward literalism and proof texting emphasize divine inspiration and historical influences. Science, not scripture, bears the burden of proof. So he's reflecting, science is not, if scripture appears to conflict with science, for a fundamentalist, science has to give way. And you open a creation museum that shows you the 7 days and so forth, things like that. Not scripture. But Bratt believes, and you'll see in his course, this is a dangerous statement here. Calvin believed that if scripture and science are in conflict, the scripture has to give way. The scripture has to be reinterpreted because God has only one truth, and he's not trying to confuse us by giving us both the book of nature and the book of the scripture. Calvin has said we are given two gifts by God, the gift of nature and the gift of the scriptures. And when they're in conflict, you have to resolve them. And you have to resolve them. If the scientific method is accepted, then you have to reinterpret your scripture. But what I'm saying right now is all part of why Karl Verduin said, I'm not going to go there. I'm going to just tell you my experiences as a pacifist. This is Billy Sunday preaching to his huge audience. And so the essential born again experience. I have to pause for an anecdote. My father was minister of Third Reformed Church when I was growing up on 12th and Pine. And one time I was downtown, I think probably during tulip time. And some great evangelist grabbed me sort of by the arm and he said, "Are you saved?" And I'm about 10 years old. And I said, "My father's the minister at Hope. My father's the minister at Third Church." He sort of, "That means nothing. Are you saved?" I went home and told my parents, and they sort of said, "You know, you're on your way. You don't have to have one particular experience." But later I worked for David C. Cook Publishing Company as editor of teacher education publications. And I left after 1 year because I disagreed with their theory of child development, which is that you need to have a specific born again experience, which they had logged in at about the 3rd grade level. And where does that leave the poor 3rd graders who aren't there? What are you supposed to do if all the curriculum is implying that specific thing has to happen that persuades you you're totally sinful and you have to repent and you're 10 years old? So there is a difference. And David C. Cook had Presbyterians as one of their main consumers of their Sunday school curriculum, but that would be the more evangelical end of the arc of people who are in all the Protestant churches, Presbyterian and Reformed, and probably Christian Reformed as well. So now meet Tunis Verduin, and we'll just quickly summarize this and then go back to the thing. Rena and Tunis bought a home in the town of South Holland when he retired. In his latest years, Tunis suffered dementia. Aunt Agnes, who was a nurse, said to Rena, "Don't think of him as he is, think of him as he used to be." She knew that the young Tunis was the kind of man who loved and cared for her, and not only understood the liberal Protestant room for pacifism, but agreed with all his heart to not make her a slave and to strongly agree with higher education, a superb RCA elder for many years whom the congregation elected over and over, including to the vice president of consistory. So this is in the RCA arc. It's not an outlying position. Carl wrote a loving biography of his father, which the Hope Library has, enterprising, able to lead others as he led a farmer's co-op to control sugar beet prices. The buyers would come around and pit one farmer against another. Well, your farmer down the street is taking 41 cents and you're asking 55, you got to go down to his price. And they got together and bucked that and set their prices and cooperated. And then anybody who still had a crop at the end of the season would get paid from the other people's coffers because they were unionizing like that. Tunis gave up his dream of South Dakota because his fiancee probably pleaded for her own kin and community and family, time to build a family. He rotated crops. He read the latest ag news. Now, he had about a 9th grade education. He read the latest agriculture news and advice from the state. Sent his kids to integrated schools because he wanted them to go to schools with Blacks in that area south of Chicago. Not a Christian school. He supported the college dreams of Marie, his wife, of their daughter Marie, my mother, in 1930, and of Carl's pacifism he was accepting in 1943 to 45, though South Holland was in general bitter and mean to the entire family, which we'll see hinted in the next part of this memoir. He loved to tell stories. He would tell you a story about getting lost in South Dakota with your horse. And all of a sudden, you got lost. And all you can see is field all the way around you in all directions, and the sky is cloudy. And you have no idea which way to turn. And what are you going to do? There's nothing to tell you where you are. So he took the reins off of his horse and just waited. And the horse got the idea and led him home. But how did he know that? So that was one story that stuck in our minds, as you can see. He also woke up one morning and a snake was in his boot. Now that's the kind of story the children will remember. And other stories from his days in South Dakota. So he made them very real for us with stories. He didn't tell us about liberal theology yet. He did love his children. He would once a year, take all like 22 of his grandchildren to the zoo. This would be a zoo if you didn't have some kind of control. But if he would do that, you know what kind of a grandfather he was. And they all laughed. They all had a good laugh. How many of you came from families that laughed? I mean, I consider that absolutely a part of family life. Okay, so that's our thing for today, Judy.
I want to know what happened to Jen, the single gal that went out to join the 3 men and run this farm in South Dakota. Did she stay there or did she come back?
Yes. All right. This group of Verduin and Rietveld would please don't tell anybody about this, but they would play card games at night. Don't tell anybody about the flinch games. And surrounding neighbors would come in. And so they would have parties of just card playing and eating together. And she met a farmer from wherever, whose name was John Munn, and he played the trombone. And she liked the way he played the trombone, and they played music, and Tunis played the tuba. So they had little concerts and everything. And before you knew it, she married John Munn and stayed in South Dakota. And they built a life in the West. So she did not come back to South Holland because she married someone out there. But she wrote about the men in South Dakota and said that men appreciated a nice girl because they were so rare, that, men really appreciated having a woman to be friends with who was like Jen was and capable. And she did keep her land for a long time and sold it later. I particularly like Rena's wedding dress, don't you? Yeah. It's class. Would you guess it was homemade? Could that dress be homemade? I say yes. Absolutely. Women had the skill to take that dress. Yep. Yeah. And what about Tunis? Was he a good catch? Yeah. If he stands up, he's taller than she is. Yeah.
The struggle between moving to the plains or staying like in South Holland or Cedar Grove, Wisconsin, went on in our family. My dad graduated from Hope in 33, was born in Prairie Grove, Kansas, and wanted to go back there. My mother was a Holland, Michigan girl, and she would not do it. Yeah, I think that struggle.
Okay. Yes. Yes, because there were Dutch enclaves, even communities of enough people that you had neighbors in a community there, but it was much more primitive than the life back where you were coming from, right?
You had the same struggle with Calvin students and Hope students who came from California
Yes,
and married somebody from the East or the Midwest.
exactly.
Where do you end up?
Yep. At that time, both Calvin and Hope had students coming from the East Coast and the West Coast. It wasn't as Michigan dominated as it is today. Yeah. Although today, fewer than 25% of either Hope or Calvin have any connection to the RCA or CRC. So it's got a much broader draw today. Okay, let's look ahead in page 2, and we want to look at, in the next 5 minutes, we want to look at the next 3 or 4 pages, which gives us next week to cover the actual camps to which he went, or maybe we could look at the Walhalla. And then next week, we'll look at Cascade Locks, which is where he spent the most of his time, and look at what was happening in the war during those years. And as he's at Cascade Locks, what is happening to him. To my relief. Oh, the FBI investigation in South Holland. And Carl can't believe that he's the only young man in town who's being subjected to an FBI investigation. Now, probably if you don't step forward, there won't be some FBI investigation, or do you think there would be? If you didn't step forward in the line. I don't think it. Okay, there wasn't. Okay, all right. Do you know what year that was? Well, it's
In 64, probably about 66.
oh, that was in the next war. All right, that wasn't in World War II. Okay, things were different by then. All right, so he registers and there's backlash, and my attempts to court a local girl were thwarted. This is This is the first reference to Joanne Parlberg is his sweetheart back home. My attempts to court a local girl were thwarted when her father forbade me to put foot on his property. So that was shocking to him. And we're going to follow up on that next week. So then this is referring to Joanne had a brother who did sign up for the war. And so John Parlberg signed up for the war. And the Rietbergs, the Rietvelds, the Verduins, and the Parlbergs are connected to this very day because Eileen's sister Marilyn married today's John Parlberg. So the Parlbergs, it's just like, everybody's related to somebody, and you know what the cousin patterns are in these big families that go back 60 or 80 years in the settlement. When the woman who had been my Sunday school teacher for at least a decade invited her class to an annual dinner at her home, I alone was not invited. And I consider that a really traumatic thing for him, to remind him how out he was considered to be. How would a woman who had taught him in Sunday school for 10 years leave him out of a party when he's a teenager? That would be such a strong message. They also had a ceremony in their church, in First Reformed Church of South Holland, Illinois. They had a ceremony to celebrate all the young men who were signing up for service. And they each received a Bible. But Carl wasn't part of that ceremony, and there was no Bible for Carl. He too is going away to give 3 years of his life to his country in service that is legal. But he's left out of the departure thing. So he knows where he feels South Holland is. Now, probably what we're saying is true, which is that sympathy for that is there in the community. Understanding is there. But the part he perceives most painfully is the betrayal, what he felt as a betrayal by people he knows and loves and who are in his community. The draft board to say no, the church to leave him out of a Sunday school picnic, and the church to leave him out of a ceremony saying goodbye to the veterans. So next week we'll follow that through to see what does happen when the war is over. And he is going to marry Joanne, but we'll talk more about that. To my relief, the Chicago Appeals Board ruled in my favor, and he gets IV classification, and he, which exempted me from military service, qualified me for induction into the CPS program. This notice came just before the beginning of fall semester at Hope College, which would have been his senior year. He was ready, he was willing, he was able, but he thought he was waiting for an assignment. So he didn't go back to college. Instead, he worked for his father on the field until he expected to receive an assignment. To be sent to camp very shortly, I did not return to Hope College for my senior year, but continued to work for my father on the farm. So a senior year is wasted. And instead, he's feeling all this turbulent feeling in South Holland where people are judging him while he's waiting and waiting and waiting for his assignment. What a painful year and what a waste, because his father's paying him, but that doesn't matter. Month by month, I waited for my orders as many men my age were to report, and I was left home amid a climate of resentment and ostracism, not from my family, but from others in the community. The winter passed and June came when I could have graduated from Hope College if I had returned for my senior year. In fact, another summer passed, and it was not until 1943 that I finally received orders from Selective Service to report to the Military Induction Center in Chicago, there to be processed for assignment to a CPS camp. I was relieved to get away from South Holland, but of course I was also full of trepidation about what was in store for me. So since it is 11 o'clock, that's where we should pause. And now for next week, now that you have all this background, we won't do a PowerPoint for next week. We'll just dig right into the story that he tells from there and the aftermath. And how many of you have in your family a story of someone who served in World War II that has passed down to us? Doug, your father served.
Right. My father served in the Navy in the Pacific during World War II.
Okay. And was in Hawaii during the.
The good news is, I guess he never left Hawaii, saw no combat.
Okay. But the position there was really important because they had to hold Hawaii for, where our troops could be assembled or whatever.
Right. I think he had a skill that the commanding officer liked, and so while other people were shipping out, he stayed behind because his commanding officer kept him busy.
So he had administrative skill, and he knew
Right.
he had those qualities.
But part of it, I don't know if he was relieved or not. There was a sense of shame about that too. He wished he could join the other sailors.
Right. So when veterans meet each other, what do they typically ask the very first? What service were you in? What unit were you in? And the next, and what did you do? And then the hidden question that children often ask, did you kill anybody? How many people did you kill? Children have that curiosity and adults do too, but that's the least likely thing to really come out in a story.
You know, you raise a question whether someone killed someone. I was the youngest of many grandchildren. I had 5 male cousins who were in World War II. 2 had been students at Hope and then enlisted during the war. And I had 5 women cousins who each had a boyfriend and who they later married at the end of the war. 2 of those were Hope students, so 4 of them had attended Hope. But the question of did you ever kill anybody never came up. But some of them, the most interesting one, at least for me as a kid, was I had a cousin who was a butcher here in Holland, and he became a medic in the South Pacific with the Marines. And I asked my grandparents one time, why was he a medic? And my grandmother said he knew what blood was all about.
He knew what blood was all about.
That's all
Yeah.
she said.
That's really amazing. All right.
Yeah.
So now we are going to see Carl go through 3 different camps where he'll live. And he's sitting there making sandwiches for U.S. Forest Service people. It sounds like just very common work. Probably not. But then what is he showing as far as the qualities of his character? What is he doing with his life while he's doing this? And how does it seem to him? And then when you think about what the men who were in the service were doing, of the 5 services, if you looked at Hope and Calvin alumni who dropped out during college, many times they were put into some kind of management or administrative position because they had some college and they had some of those abilities. You know, they were, was he in the Army? Was your father in the Army?